Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Abolition Democracy 1213. This evening, we turn to the question of borders, a topic that's become central to discussions of abolition and justice. As you know all too well, as we gather here tonight, a large number of children and teenagers from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are attempting to enter the United States to seek refuge, resulting in record numbers of apprehensions, likely to exceed anything we've seen over the past 2 decades. In February 2021 alone, the US Border Patrol detained about 100,000 persons at the US-Mexico border. And that's only at our doorstep. In the Middle East, the Syrian refugee crisis now enters its 10th year, and it continues unabated, with 6.6 million Syrians living as refugees and another 6.7 million people displaced within Syria. In South America, the crisis in Venezuela has pushed about 4 million Venezuelans out of the country as refugees. In Africa, about 2.2 million people from South Sudan are displaced as refugees abroad. And across the world, at the end of the year 2019, there were almost 80 million people displaced from their homes, 26 million of which are living as refugees abroad. Paulina Ochoa Espejo opens her essay for this evening's seminar, an essay that she entitles Abolish ICE, asking the following question. Should we jettison the ideology and the institutional mechanisms that allow border regimes to persist? Should we abolish the state institutions that enforce border regimes? Yes, we should, she answers. The border control regimes are unjust because they violently enforce discrimination on the basis of nationality, race, and sex. In other words, on characteristics that should not be grounds for exclusion from a political order that seeks legitimacy in liberal and democratic values. I think our guests tonight will agree about this and about the need to abolish the violent enforcement of borders, to abolish ICE. But what do we do with borders themselves, and how shall we think about them? Do we abolish borders outright, or do we retain borders but open them? Or do we retain borders but find different ways to maintain them? We have tonight a remarkable set of critical thinkers to address this question, all of whom have written extensively about this question. And we're also placing in discussion, in conversation this evening, the new book by Harsha Walia, Borders and Rule, that argues for the abolition of borders. Harsha Walia was not able to join us tonight, but we assigned her book for the seminar, and which was just released in March of 2021, and we'll also be engaging that book. There, Walia urges us to rethink the crisis at the borders today, and in a way, kind of asks us to rethink the very way in which I started this seminar, right? To recast it, not to conceive of the problem as one caused by refugees crossing borders or taking to the seas, but instead to understand the problem as an economic and political crisis. Not, in her words, to depict migrants and refugees as the cause of an imagined crisis at the border, when in fact mass migration is the outcome of the actual crises of capitalism, conquest, and climate change. Now, in this respect, methodologically, I think Seyla Benhabib agrees and urges us in her article, The End of the 1951 Refugee Convention, to analyze and understand how we in the West participate in the harrowing experiences of migration. And she asks us to search, right, in her words, for the roots of the ethical responsibilities we bear towards each other, resulting from the economic and political systems we're situated in. And in answering that question, in answering that imperative, Joe Carens takes the position that we need to open the borders. And in his classic argument for open borders in his 2013 book, The Ethics of Immigration, Joe Carens compares global citizenship today to feudalism. Where does this lead us then? I think that our three guests, our three brilliant critical theorists this evening, have certain disagreements that I think will be very productive and that we're going to try and focus on, to focus on the productive disagreements as a way then to try and understand how to approach the question of borders. So let me introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting this evening. We will hear first from Paulina Ochoa Espejo, who is professor of political science at Haverford College. Before joining Haverford, she taught at Yale University. She works at the intersection of democratic theory and the history of political thought, and she's primarily interested in questions regarding popular sovereignty and borders. She's written about populism, the boundaries of the demos, immigration, the right to exclude, the relation between democracy and territorial rights, the moral relevance of borders, and questions of border control. She's the author of this new book, On Borders, Territories, Legitimacy, and the Rights of Place, which we've read parts of for this evening. Also the author of The Time of Popular Sovereignty, Process and the Democratic State from 2011, co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Populism, and author of many other articles in distinguished journals, American Journal of Political Science and others. So thank you so much, Paulina, for joining us. After Paulina, we'll hear from Seyla Benhabib, who is the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emeritus at Yale University. And now I'm delighted, faculty member here at Columbia Law School, an affiliate faculty member in the Columbia University Department of Philosophy, and a senior fellow at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. Professor Benhabib is a distinguished international scholar known for her research and teaching on social and political thought, on critical theory, particularly the 20th century German thought, and on Hannah Arendt. Over the past 2 decades, she has become really recognized for her contributions on migration and citizenship studies as well. And one of her most recent books is Exile, Statelessness, and Migration, Playing Chess with History from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin, which we've read in other contexts, in other seminars. This evening, we read the article about the 1951 convention. Of course, she's also written formative texts in critical theory, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of normative foundations of critical theory, Situating the Self, Gender, Community, and Postmodernism and Contemporary Ethics, The Claims of Culture, and many other books. And she also established with Andrew Arato the journal Constellations, an international journal of critical and democratic theory. So we're really delighted to have you back, Seyla, this evening. And then we'll be hearing from Professor Joseph Carens, who is Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Toronto. Now, he is a leading advocate, perhaps the I was going to say grandfather, but the grandfather of the open borders position. And his research focuses on questions about justice, equality, and freedom in democratic communities. He's the author of Culture, Citizenship, and Community, which won the 2002 McPherson Award, Equality, Moral Incentives in the Markets, and of course, The Ethics of Immigration at Oxford, which we've read chapter 11 for this evening. And he's also written, of course, in a lot of other journals, the Boston Review, Political Theory, etc. So it's wonderful to have you, Joe, with us and to think about open borders with you. 3 brilliant critical theorists, 3 different views on borders. And that's what we're hoping to have, a kind of intense conversation about where we go from here. So let me turn it over, Paulina, to you first, so that you can present, and we'll have the 3 presentations. I'll try not to intervene too much, but then we'll open it up with our students and go into the conversation. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for joining us, and thank you, Paulina, for starting us off this evening.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that intro. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Fonda, for taking care of everything. So in this presentation, I don't want to bore you repeating my blog post when I called to abolish ICE. You already read it, and if you haven't, it's already there posted, so you can turn back to it. I would like to talk to you about something more personal, actually. Those who have read my book will have noticed that it's about borders, but it's not about immigration, it's not about abolition. So in the past, during a panel, an angry co-panelist said that my work was too theoretical and said that he had had enough with detached academics that were not getting real and dealing directly with issues of immigration and racial discrimination and oppression. So today I want to make these connections explicit. And I also want to make a defense of being too theoretical and to preempt a critique of those who think that calling to abolish ICE and to change borders fundamentally is too idealistic. So it is true that my book on borders is not about immigration, and it's also not explicitly about abolition or racial oppression. But believe me, it is about those topics too. Let me explain why. When I was a child, I spent every Saturday and Sunday for almost 2 years in a crowded jail in the outskirts of Mexico City. My dad was incarcerated when I was 10 years old. He was held in preventive prison without bail, even though he was accused of a non-violent crime. And he died in prison of stress-related causes. A few weeks after his death, he was cleared of all charges. So this happened in Mexico in the 1980s. In Mexico, you really do not want to get caught in the criminal justice system. Well, I guess you don't want to get caught in the criminal justice system anywhere. But in Mexico, it's not only one group of people that has bad relations with the police. I don't think anyone trusts the police. And the legal system is erratic, it is corrupt, it's inefficient, and justice is arbitrary. As I grew up, I hardly ever mentioned my experience to anyone. Nobody around me talked about prisons or incarceration, and there was a lot of stigma. And I did not know how to associate my personal experience with a wider social cause. But I did know that what happened to my father and to my family was politically motivated. So perhaps because of this, I ended up a political philosopher, obsessed about democratic legitimacy and always hoping that despite its limitations, democracy could be a path to deal with the injustices that I knew so well. So I think that also the hope that things were not as bad in the United States is why I came here, why I became an immigrant. By the way, it never occurred to me that coming to the United States was a form of asylum or political refuge. I just came in as a student and I stayed here with a scholar's visa. But this is a good reminder that there really isn't a sharp distinction between the people that come here to make money and those who are running away from danger or political persecution. Anyway, I had some hope that things were better here. Because although I was not naive about the United States shortcomings, I was taught that in the United States there was rule of law, right? Rule of law. And what I didn't fully understand then is that you can do a lot of injustice without straying from the law. And I didn't understand that being in the wrong side of power, it's probably worse in a place where power complies with the law, but bends it at the service of the structures of oppression. So as Eduardo Mendieta points in his introduction to Angela Davis' Abolition Democracy, in the United States, it's precisely the law that renders Black lives and bodies expendable. And for me, this irony became clear when I noticed the violence embedded in the boundaries of democracy. What protects a person from power in a democracy is that she has rights. But to get those, you have to be a citizen. And who gets to be a citizen? Who gets to be part of the people? Who are we the people when we talk about popular sovereignty, when we're making the law? Who are the people when we talk about territorial rights, about national self-determination, about border control? In the United States, we did not originally include women and children. And of course, Black people were historically excluded, even after abolition, even after the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. We also exclude migrants. but not because they are foreigners, which might be expected. It excludes them primarily because migrants are racialized. It did not take long to see that in the United States, it was not borders, but race, what really determines the boundaries of the demos. Race has legitimized oppression, exploitation, and exclusion through voting laws, gerrymandering, and the penitentiary system. Race also structures families, social relations, elite institutions, and academia. And it was academia that made me a migrant. I was expected to fit a particular mold. So here I was again in the outskirts of justice. And it was my previous works on the boundaries of democracy and the awareness of racial marginalization that led me to study borders. In the last decade, I spent some time in borders, some in the border of Mexico and Guatemala near Tapachula. And I saw people cross the Suchiate River as the Mexican Border Patrol watches from the bridge. And I saw all these new installations built using the blueprints of the US Border Patrol that dot the landscape in Chiapas. And I also spent some time in the northern border of Mexico. In 2015, I walked through an immigration detention center in Florence, Arizona, with a group of undergrads that were coming with me to do research for my book. A couple of nights before driving to Flores, we visited a shelter in Nogales, Sonora, on the other side of the border. And we talked to people who had been recently deported to Mexico. They told us the stories of having crossed in Texas or California and had been dropped in the middle of the night in Nogales, Sonora. They told us about the CBP prisons, and particularly with the nights in the hieleras, which are the infamous ice boxes where people are put in the first night in immigration detention. As we took our tour of the detention center in Florence, the guard continuously told us that this is not prison. It is a detention center, an immigration processing center. No matter that the place, by the way, is run by a Corrections Corporation of America, of course. But he insisted that they had gotten the highest ranking in the last report, all 5 stars in human rights. But I saw the place and I saw the children and I saw their moms and I saw how they were separated from their dads. And I thought that to all of those kids, to all of these people, this is not temporary detention. This is just prison. And prison, which is the experience of absolute powerlessness vis-a-vis the state, prison is the point of it all. The point, according to the guard, is to bureaucratically process migrants. But bureaucratic process is not about registering. It is mainly meant to show these people their place in the social order. So processing may be not so inaccurate after all. Processing is the right metaphor because the process is to turn an asylum seeker into an illegal migrant, somebody who's criminalized and racially marked. The migrants who end up in detention are primarily brown people from Central America and Mexico. While in popular imagination, an expat is a white person who has to deal with the natives, a migrant, and particularly a migrant in the United States, is an abject creature. In the detention center, legal asylum seekers, economic migrants, and criminal offenders are color-coded. They are made to wear different uniforms, and they wear different color bracelets. This tagging effectively criminalizes them all. The great majority of those held in the detention center have not committed any crimes or offenses, but they're all processed into migrants, i.e., in that context, illegals. This should make any sane person shudder. When some people in a legal order are held in detention without having committed a crime, they are oppressed. As Thomas Donahue has argued in his book On Freedom for All, if you share in disorder, even if you're a perpetrator of the oppression or a bystander, you too are unfree. It's not poetry at all that's to say no one is free if others are oppressed. This is the hard, cold truth. If you live under such a government, you live under an unchecked authoritarian regime. So you too are unfree. That is reality. When I was a child visiting my father in jail, there was not much to do other than sit around a table when adults were talking. So we had a box of markers and color pencils. And I spent a lot of the time drawing landscapes and seascapes and ideal ecosystems full of fairy-like creatures dotted around. I got these images from spending time at the ocean, my grandfather's house in the Pacific. I remember that somebody came by and asked me, "Do you like fantasy?" And I couldn't say it back then. I could not have articulated the thought. But it was clear that the forest and the ocean that surrounded my grandfather's house was not fantasy. It was real. Well, not counting the fairies, but everything else. So in contrast, the idea of what was real and realistic, which I was being taught in my civic school book, those were obviously fantasies. I was being taught that we lived in a democratic republic with 3 branches of government and free and fair elections. That obviously was a fantasy in 1980s Mexico. When people talk about immigration and they say, like a recent New York Times op-ed, walls don't work, open borders don't work, it's time to try realism. I want to remind every lawyer and every activist and every politician that reality is the fact that people cross borders. Reality is the fact that people are being held prisoners without charges. Reality is that states don't have a handle on trafficking and smuggling. And what people in power call getting real or being realistic is often a way of endorsing the fantasy that we can have a legal nation state where everybody belongs to the legal order and everything is subsumed under the law without injustice and without reminders. So my comments for this seminar and my book call for what I think is a truly realistic position. It's a position that acknowledges the reality of current injustices and embracing the reality that our communities are always racially mixed, that they are interdependent, the reality that people move, that people will join the people they love and go places where there is work, and you cannot enforce immigration away. My book provides an account of borders which takes into consideration the real connections that already exist and focuses on the real fact that we share water and air and land, that we share the climate emergency that cannot be blocked by a border wall. So we already have local communities and organizations. We should use those to include migrants and seek to abolish ICE. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you. That was very moving. And thank you for sharing that with us and placing it in such a personal context. I think that that's absolutely essential. And there's so many of us who think and work in this area have ourselves been affected in these ways. And I think it's practically impossible, right, to separate those experiences and one's own movements from these issues. And so I'm so thankful for you putting that in conversation. I know Seyla Benhabib as well has personal experience and of movement and migration that is also so important, I'm sure, to her own theorizing. And I'm glad we'll come back to your realistic position and also to the point you made at the beginning, which was that you wanted to maintain a space for the theorization and the academic conversation as part of this, as part of the movement, as part of the organizing as well. So I'm hoping we can come back to that as well. Thank you, Paulina. Seyla, do you want to speak next?
Yes. I sort of ended up changing the view and losing myself.
Okay.
Let
Well,
me go back to the gallery view. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Paulina, for this really moving story. We were colleagues at Yale for 7 years, and I never heard you talk about this. It's very, very, very touching indeed. I myself was a migrant and a student with a Turkish visa, a scholar with a Turkish visa in Europe for over 10 years. And undoubtedly, that experience of crossing borders with an unwanted passport before I became an American citizen marks some of my experiences. But without any apologies for theory tonight, I am, in fact, going to approach these problems from a rather theoretical and legal theoretical perspective. In the last 10, 15 years, I have worked on this problematic of the rights of others. And my work on the rights of others was not exclusively focused on refugee questions. In fact, in that particular book of 2004, I did not make an analytic distinction between migrants and refugees. I was mainly concerned about questions of integration and assimilation, and in particular, the whole complex of human rights versus the rights of resident non-nationals in the developing European Union context. Now, most recently, I have started working on the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the most general legal framework to which 140 odd signatory states are still bound. Focusing on the 1951 Refugee Convention is helpful for thinking about the problem of borders in two ways. First, because it shows to us this dualistic and sometimes schizophrenic logic of the post-World War II modern state system, which on the one hand is built upon the principle of exclusive territoriality, and on the other hand, respect for human rights. And the 1951 Refugee Convention is one of the earliest international human rights agreements, together with the UDHR and the 1948 Geneva Conventions. However, in recent years, the 1951 Refugee Convention has is itself being hollowed out, even by states that try to observe its fundamental principle, namely the principle of non-refoulement. That is, that if an asylum seeker arrives on your territory, you have an obligation to test that claim and to determine this person's eligibility. Now, this is an administrative legal procedure, and there are, let me say right at the outset, I do not for a second think that the 1951 Convention alone is an answer to problems of economic migration, climate change migration, etc. And in particular, the 51 Refugee Convention has come under serious strain because it has 5 protected categories, namely categories of nationality, ethnicity, religious belief, political opinion, and a grab bag called membership in a social group that is being recently more and more expanded, for example, to cover gender-related violence committed against women. So there are serious issues in the theoretical structure of the 51 Convention. But even more perversely, what is also happening now is that states that are signatories are engaging in a number of practices, which we also see in the United States, which I call deterritorialization. And what deterritorialization means is that, in effect, the state upon whose territory the refugee or the asylum seeker arrives finds a number of means of limiting or escaping responsibility. The most extreme case of this was Australia, which resorted to something called excision, whereby it excised literally territory, Christmas Islands, Ashmore Reef, etc. I document this in my paper. But there is also the creation of law-free zones, something that Matthew Gibney calls 1,000 little Guantanamos. And as we know, there has been a lot in the US courts in the last decade about the extent to which, in fact, Guantanamo was or was not under the jurisdiction of the US courts. But these practices of deterritorialization and creating zones, quote unquote, without law or free zones, have the function of removing the control of the people in whose names these actions are undertaken from sight and from view. Okay, so it is a de-democratization process that states engage in. Let me now say a few things about about what's going on in the United States, which, as Paulina, I think, very well said, that the whole system has turned into a system of what Judith Resnick and others have called crimmigration, namely the criminalization of migration, where the distinction between the asylum seeker and the migrant, the children and the adult and so on, have disappeared. The US has been up to these tricks for a very long time. And I would say that, in fact, even the category of a designated port of entry is not a category that is found in the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is good law in the United States. The United States and the 1980 Refugee Act makes the Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol good law. But there are a number of ways in which the United States, as always, creates what is known as American exceptionalism, American exemptionalism. Now, what are the features of this crimmigration system, criminalization of migration? The first is the extreme use of deportation and incarceration without the possibility of appeal for migration delicts. The second is the securitization of migration since 9/11, with the collapse of the Immigration and Naturalization Office into this mammoth bureaucratic organization, which I'm sure many of you know about, called Department of Homeland Security, and the seamless way in which the security bureaucracy increases its budget, increases its personnel, and just absorbs also the migration movement. But as Paulina also mentioned, perhaps the most perverse aspect of the system is the way in which the growth of private prison corporations private prison corporations have entered the immigration detention business. These are groups like Core Civic and the GEO group that in 2015, they were holding 23,000 individuals in their detention centers, and ex-President Trump wanted to increase the number of people held in these detention centers and paid for by the US public to 60,000. Many of the individuals operating these detention centers, or really basically criminal incarceration centers, are not trained either as social workers or as or are not familiar with the law. And that's what also makes it so incredibly easy for them to lie, to basically lie to asylum seekers at the American border, telling them that they do not have the right to place an asylum, that they have to go over to Mexico, the so-called metering system. And there has been a great deal of work on this that documents, in fact, how the United States, particularly under the previous administration, has been in violation of the 51 Convention. Now, what is to be done? As a critical intellectual, I see my task first as holding light to what Hannah Arendt called halls of oblivion. That is, to the predicament of the most vulnerable and the ones without any rights: underage children, pregnant migrant women, victims of gang violence and rape, victims of traffic smugglers, and many, many others. So these individuals are subject to criminalization also in the process of crossing the border, as Paulina has indicated. And the United Nations has developed several global compacts for safe, orderly, and regular migration. But all these compacts, and this is the structure of the United Nations, okay, uphold the sovereign right of the state to determine who comes in and who does not come in, and their compliance with United Nations regulations is voluntary. So I don't have much hope that these international agreements are going to resolve the problems, although, okay, they should proceed. But I want to end with an unsettling thought. I'm not going to say borders, yes or no. We will have a discussion about this. We have to understand that the migrant has become, whether the migrant or the asylum seeker, has become the symbol of extreme vulnerability for populations themselves who are threatened by the race to the bottom. And this is, of course, racially marked, and also marked in gender-specific ways. But the tremendous mobilization by right-wing movements against migration is a political problem that we also have to reckon with, and we have to understand, and we have to combat, and we have to fight against. So I think there is a great deal of work that needs to be done in terms of establishing coalitions across civil rights groups and migrants groups, across workers' rights, one of the most sore issues, right? The question of globalization and whether the rise of third world, country is diminishing the work options in first world countries, etc. In other words, the questions are going to call for what I'll call a vision of interdependent sovereigns and a kind of global ethic of responsibility and solidarity. So maybe we can return to the question of borders, yes, no. My answer has been porous borders.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Seyla. Thank you so much for also bringing in Hannah Arendt in terms of this notion of shedding light. And as part of today's seminar, we also read her essay, We Refugees, which is important in the way in which she intervenes precisely to take up the mantle in a way of claiming the name refugees, in part, I think, to demonstrate, well, in a powerful move that also talks about the extreme vulnerability, as you were talking, Seyla Benhabib, but also as a way to try and galvanize and present resistance to these issues and problems. And thanks for raising the question of solidarity and porous borders. So we'll come back to that, to porous borders, after we hear from Joe first on open borders.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Fonda, for helping to organize this, and a little daunting to come after Paulina and Seyla. But so I too am an immigrant, but a kind of privileged position. I moved to Canada for an academic job and grew up in the United States. So moved at the age of 40, but so I want to say one thing at the outset about that experience of being an immigrant in Canada, because it connects with what Paulina said about racialization and, one might add, economic situation. I was a privileged immigrant. So being a permanent resident in Canada, my situation was not in any significant way different from that of a Canadian citizen. My rights were just as secure. I had all those rights. I often cite Arendt's famous passage, the right that citizenship is the right to have rights. And I say, well, that's misleading in some respects. I was not a citizen in Canada for 10 years, and I had very secure rights, much more secure than Canadian citizens who were racialized or impoverished. So part of what we have to pay attention to here are the background structures, which we want to criticize and challenge. And I'm going to link that in a minute to Harsha Walia's book. So in my presentation, I'm going to sort of assume that people have read it, but basically I want to say one thing first about the context of the presentation and then the substance. One of the reasons I was attracted when Bernard invited me to this seminar is because it is situated in an intellectual tradition which is sort of different from the one I normally work in. It's much more drawn to continental and critical theory. And both Seyla and Paulina, they overlap a bit. They work in that tradition, but also somewhat different. You could hear that with Seyla's work being rooted in critical political theory, where you're constantly paying attention to the interaction between what is and what ought to be and connecting it to the social reality as a kind of critical social thought in that way. And Paulina's discussion, first, very powerful. I thought one of the things that we learned from Paulina's opening, I expect everybody had the same reaction I did, was that you learn something from that personal story that you don't get from the abstract theoretical discussions. You see something, it opens a work. And then the theoretical discussion is also illuminating. And she gave the kind of theoretical perspective, which is, again, in a different kind of tradition, kind of a border between the continental tradition and the analytic tradition. She kind of crosses over between the two. So I like that, because I think that one learns from these different perspectives. And sometimes you get things from one perspective that you just aren't going to get when you stick within another intellectual perspective. But my own perspective intellectually is this, what's broadly speaking the Anglo-American analytic tradition, where you try to identify issues, clarify principles, consider objections, and there's a certain kind of way of proceeding intellectually. But even within that tradition, there's variation. So here's the way I try to structure my own thought, is that what you need to do in any conversation, if you don't want to talk past one another, is you have to pay attention to what are the presuppositions of the conversation. And all conversations have presuppositions. They have normative presuppositions. They also have empirical presuppositions. And it seems to me that a lot of debates that go on in intellectual life, including debates around immigration, are people talking past one another because one person has one set of presuppositions and the other one just simply has a different set of presuppositions. They're asking a different kind of question. For example, the what is to be done question. So we all care about what is to be done, but what are you presupposing about the context in which you're asking the question, what is to be done? So one way to ask that question, which is what I tried to do in my book, really, at the end of the book, not at the beginning of the book, is to say, suppose we were not constrained by political constraints of the real world as we face it today. And we just want to think about what would a just world look like. Now, notice that argument itself has presuppositions. It presupposes that we understand something about what justice is. But the argument there is that would be a world of open borders. But it's also, and this is important in understanding my argument for open borders, the primary characteristic of a just world would not be open borders, it would be equality. Whatever differences there would be among forms of social organization, the lives of human beings would have equal conditions and opportunities for all over time, over generations, across geography. And in that context, open borders would make a lot of sense and not be a problem. So as some of the opening suggestions, as Walia says, for example, I see problems with migration as a symptom, not a cause of the current problems. It's a byproduct of an unjust world order. In an unjust world, open borders wouldn't be a problem. So, but there's another level in which I like to engage, which I think I'm going to now refer to Harsha's book. She's less inclined. I think it's helpful and desirable, I don't say everybody has to do it, to think about what your ideal institutions and practices would look like. And so one of the arguments for open borders that I make is, we know open borders wouldn't be a problem if you had relative economic equality, because, for example, we've had that experience in the European Union, and these, people forget, were states that had different languages, different cultures, had fought wars with one another for hundreds of years. But once you had a certain background set of economic conditions and institutions, it was possible to have open borders, and you didn't have all the problems that people associate with mass migration. So I think it's useful to have concrete examples of how you will build up and structure the ideal that you have, even when you're not working with any political constraints. Again, a concrete example, in earlier sessions of this seminar, we've had critiques of capitalism, critiques of private property, with which at one level I'm very sympathetic. But I think we have to ask the question, okay, that's bad. What would we put in its place? What is the alternative? You're going to tear this down, but what are you going to build up instead? So what's the picture that you have? And in that context, for example, we can't forget about the problems with central planning in the Soviet Union, which were not just due to bad actors doing bad things, but also to problems of social organization, which, by the way, was what lay behind Bernard alluded to this earlier book of mine called Equality, Moral Incentives in the Market, which was an attempt to show that you could distribute income equally in a market economy and still take advantage of the efficiencies of the market. So that was a kind of, I don't think of that as something that is a policy proposal. I think of that as a way of getting us to see that it's a problem of structure and organization and norms, and there would be ways of reorganizing those that could work in theory. And so then that we have something to aim at in terms of transformation. Similarly, the open borders argument, from my perspective, is not the solution to our problems is just to open the borders now. The solution to our problems is to transform the global social order. And opening borders in some ways, in concrete context, so I'm entirely in agreement with Seyla's focus on the people who are marginalized and disadvantaged. And so it's not that I don't care. Yes, we should do what we can with the migrants who are struggling, but we should see the immediate problems as also a symptom of a wider set of problems which we have to tackle. So that goes again to these layers of analysis. So on the one hand, I want to think about what would the ideal look like. But also, I think it's very important not just to work at that level. So here's another level that you can take. You assume certain background conditions, which at another level you think are unjust. So, okay, let's assume the state system is in order, is going to continue, and is in existence. And what we want to think about is the refugee regime. So then, I think, and it'd be interesting to see whether Seyla agrees with this kind of approach or not. I think it can be helpful to say, okay, even if we didn't have the transformation of the world, what would an ideal refugee regime look like? And for example, one thing that leaps out about that is that you wouldn't have this narrow definition of who's a refugee. You would have a much more expansive definition of who's a refugee, having to do with the threats to basic human rights. But then you might ask the question, okay, should we try to open up the definition of the refugee regime in the international legal order and transform it? And my answer to that would be no. So this leads to the next level. Well, why? You've just drawn this picture of what would be ideal. Well, the answer is one of the things that we know under current political conditions, I say we know, it's a judgment, is that if you try to change the definition of refugee in the under current circumstances, it's not going to be broader, it's going to be narrower. It's going to be more constricted. So you have a picture of what would be better, again, a very constrained kind of better, but you can see that what you should do with respect to action is quite different from what the ideal requires, because if you try to go down that path, you will make things worse. So this leads to this point that I tried to make in the first part of my, the thing that I posted, which is when you are thinking about political action, you have to think about possibilities and consequences. And frankly, that's not something political theorists have any particular expertise about. So it's what we can contribute to is certain visions of ideals and certain critical perspectives, but you have to know what's going to happen. And if doing something which is generally in the direction of ideal is going to make things worse in the long run, that's not a good idea to do in the here and now. And so that's kind of what I find a little puzzling and problematic about some of the reflections that I see in books like Walia, is I don't have a picture of how we get there from here and why. So this is the question of when do you judge, what kinds of judgments do you make about what's possible in the here and now and what the consequences will be for later, and how are those connected to political theory? And my view is, for the most part, political theorists are not particularly expert about those judgments. We're just citizens like anybody else. And some people have better political antennae than others. And so we should be conscious of the limitations of what we can offer and recognize the need, the critical importance of those judgments in terms of political action, and not imagine that you can simply move directly from theory to practice. I think I'll stop there because I'm sort of hoping we'll have a more extended discussion.
Yes, great. And the discussion is about to start. So thank you, Joe, for that and for positioning yourself so clearly. So here, I think I'd like to ask some pointed questions, I think, in order to try to really get us into conversation. And here's how, let me start in this way. To Paulina, so I like the idea of you're taking a realistic position. In a way, I understand the objection that your interlocutor was saying at the when you started off, kind of like, hey, stop giving us this, academic stuff. As a question to you, maybe about the place-based or the space-based notion of borders that you're proposing in your book. Because I think that as you're presenting this as a realistic position. So then the reaction to it, I think, is how is that gonna change the fact of borders in a sense, and how is that gonna, and how does that shift? I mean, I understand clearly the opposition that you present in your book to identitarian and identity notions that found borders in terms of sovereignty, but it's less clear to me how moving to a different model, but maintaining the borders based on those spatial or place-based ways of thinking about location significantly changes the equation in terms of then you know, whether if there is a border, even from a different perspective, there is the potential for exclusion or not exclusion. In other words, I know that you specifically position yourself against a no borders position. So you specifically address Harsha Walia's argument and you reject the no borders. But I'm not sure that you embrace it. Do you embrace an open borders with this different conceptualization of how we think about borders? If so, then this goes to Joe, and although I'm gonna, my second question is to Seyla, but this does then intersect with the question of how, and this is a question for Joe, how do open borders differ from no borders, really? I mean, and I know that you too are not taking the abolish borders position at all. But realistically, I mean, if we, from the migration and border transition perspective, what's the difference between no borders and open borders? I mean, if we're thinking within a space like the Schengen space, I understand the continuation of democratic processes and sovereignty, etc. But I take it that then doesn't affect in any way migration. So from the perspective of migration, could we say that it's effectively as if there were no borders, right? I mean, but that's my third question, because I wanted to bring in Seyla first, which is in the difference between Paulina and Shayla's conversation and discourse, I really felt this marked difference regarding the role of law, really. And Seyla, you are framed within a human rights paradigm, I think. I mean, even though you acknowledge the deficiencies of the 51 Convention, the ways in which a country like the United States is violating it all the time by its gains at the border, nevertheless, the notion of porousness, I think, that you embrace, the porousness remains one that is defined by a human rights framework. And Paulina, as I was listening to you, I heard this kind of critical legal studies move that that I know Seyla knows I'm very fond of, which is kind of the critique of the rule of law. In fact, you said you can do a lot of injustice under the rule of law, was a statement you made, and I was jotting that down because that's my life. That's the life I live in: injustice under the rule of law. Representing people on death row, representing somebody in Guantanamo. I mean, that's my reality. And so I get a sense that your place-based position has a different relationship to law, very much so than Seyla's more porous borders approach. And maybe that's a question to Seyla. It's also in part a question to you, Paulina. But let me start. Why don't you start, Paulina, with this, with maybe trying to explain how your place-specific and your place-based approach, theoretically, what it entails, kind of realistically and pointedly, to the question of open border or porous border. Yeah.
Actually, let me begin with the question. I'm going to respond to what you're saying, but let me begin with no borders.
Okay.
So how is, because it will illustrate how this, what I'm trying to say. How is no borders different from open borders, you asked Joe. So what I would say is like, well, if you commit a crime and there's open borders, you can go wherever you want, but do you prefer to go to Mexican jail or American jail if you commit a crime? there is a clear difference if you have different jurisdictions. So in a world with open borders, you could go wherever you want, but there would be different jurisdictions, right? There would be different countries. So there is a big difference. And what I want to say in what I write is that we're so committed to borders being the boundaries of a group of people that we forget that they're actually territorial jurisdictions that we are talking about. That's what borders are. So good borders are borders that fall in the right place. That's what I have in mind. So a world, I mean, there's so many concerns with borders that do not have to do anything with immigration. Think about how we share water. Think about all the things that are related to borders. Think about how do we distribute space? Think about gerrymandering. Think about like housing policy. All the things that are related to borders that are not related to immigration. So why does this matter? Well, if what matters is jurisdiction, what really we care about is how are we going to govern such that the places where we have are shared by the people who are here. And that is how I in my mind, one can think about like what matters is that in my view, a good border would be like a perfect border, if you will, would be borders that are placed in the right spot. And I wrote the whole book about this. And they would be open. But I'm with Joe in this. This is an ideal position. It's out there. In fact, I take Joe's shifting presupposition paradigm directly in my book. So I follow him perfectly there. So in an ideal world, we would have the borders where they should go, which is related to environmental conditions. And everybody who happens to be in a territory has all the rights just by stepping in. Mm-hmm. Now, in the real world, that is in the world we live now, we can use this orientation of trying to think in terms of environmental concerns and the fact that we are already here to organize. So it's an orientation, it's a way of thinking. We're not going to think of each other as if we were co-nationals. We're going to think of each other as if we were neighbors. Because we are sharing stuff. We just happen to be together in the same spot. So it's an orientation, a way of thinking. So in our world that is marked by borders, let's think that way. We're thinking in terms of environmental conditions and the way we relate to the places where we are. And we're relating to each other in those terms. So that's how I think about place-based obligations and how I think about place-based obligations in the real world. Mm. I can give you more examples, but later on.
Okay, but actually, before we jump to the next question, let me just offer one way of thinking about this. As you were talking and Joe and Seyla, I was thinking, I mean, is it possible that we're using the term borders here in two different ways and that it might be helpful to pull those apart? Mm-hmm. Borders for purposes of migration, borders for purposes of democratic decision-making, mm-hmm. right? And in a way, it feels to me as if some of this could be clarified if we used the term in those two different ways more clearly, because it seems to me that possibly the no borders and the open borders position is one that is effectively talking about borders purely from an immigration perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be a jurisdictional contour around the self-governing that takes place in the space. So in other words, Nogales, one side versus the other of Nogales, you know, we could have a jurisdictional contour around the US Nogales to say, within this space, democratic decision-making is going to determine, how water is distributed, and all of the non-immigration. And in Nagas, and you might want to say space-wise, well, actually, those should be one space. We could have that conversation as well. But you could, but that's not about the migration border. There, you could want to retain a border for purely political democratic decision-making. Use the term open border that Joe is using, but actually the open border from a migration-only perspective means there's no border. Do you see what I'm suggesting? That maybe the problem here is that we're talking about slightly different things, which is a border for purpose of migration only versus a border for purpose of democratic decision-making. And
Bernard, can I come in here?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I mean, in 2004, in The Rights of Others, I had a phrase which caused a lot of consternation. I said, empires have frontiers, democracies need boundaries. That's what we are talking about. Democracies need boundaries, and this will lead me to the question about the law, precisely because you need to know the boundaries of jurisdictional authority. Let's leave aside gerrymandering and so on for the time being. But the simplest definition that one can give is that democratic accountability, I have to know which laws I live under, and for what reasons, for what jurisdictional purposes, whether I'm a citizen or I'm a permanent resident or an asylum seeker, there has to be a source of clear jurisdiction that defines my obligations to this authority, right? So, without that, you cannot have democratic organization. But these jurisdictional boundaries exist in cities. They exist in regions. You have federalist arrangements. You have federationalist arrangements, right? Mm-hmm. So that is correct. I mean, I think all of us here subscribe to the position, if I'm not mistaken, that borders are artificial, historical, social constructs that have no moral value. For me, boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries do have moral value because they enable democratic accountability and accountability. Now, what does this imply in terms of the law? And this is a conversation we have been having for a long time. My position, as you know, from critical, the Frankfurt School position is that, and Joe specified this correctly, the law has two aspects, normativity and facticity, to use Habermas's terms. Facticity, because the law is about a system of coercion and violence, and the law is on the books as a result of historical developments, political chicanery, economic constraints, but it also has a claim to normativity, and the normativity of the law can change across historical regimes. In a liberal democratic regime, the normativity of the law is inevitably bound up with respect for human rights. So I think that it's not so much just the human rights perspective, but it is this normativity and facticity. And I hear what you're saying, that your task is to find justice within the framework of a rule of law. But one has to keep this duality in mind. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we live under a system of coercion continuously, and we don't have the possibility of what I would say the imminent critique of the law, the pushing for the utopian emancipatory moment, where I usually cite Derrida, justice à venir, justice is always to come, okay? Mm-hmm. But the rule of law is part of a framework of justice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, let me just, I saw your hand go up, Paulina. I know I want to get Joe in, but on the other hand, I just want to, I'm gonna, what is it? There's, I want to get a kind of a definitive statement here, just out of purposes of clarity, okay? If we, so let's for a moment, let's talk about boundaries in the way you just did, Seyla, okay? Democratic boundaries. Okay, and those democratic boundaries. Now I feel as if I'm pulling out Harsha Walia's text because I think that there may be in her argument against borders a movement towards a form of internationalism that would also object to democratic boundaries. I'll go back to the text, but I think that if we allow for democratic boundaries, okay, and democratic boundaries alone, and we determine those boundaries, maybe we adopt Paulina's place-based approach to democratic boundaries, so that, you know, maybe the Nogaleses would be one place, and there wouldn't be a boundary through them, say, or some, but a place-based approach. Do you three, and I think, I'm sorry, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I think this is going to call for a yes or no answer, but would you agree that we can maintain those democratic boundaries, but there should be no immigration boundaries or restrictions of movement as between those democratic boundaries? Now, obviously, Joe, that's your position, I take it. I mean, that's the idea of open borders. It's that there are effectively no borders for purposes of migration, even if there are democratic boundaries.
I don't see how there cannot be democratic boundaries. I'm in complete agreement. That's why I don't take a no borders position. You have to have, now, again, if you can use your distinction, fine, you only mean, but there's no difference between no borders and open borders if we're prepared to accept the existence of boundaries for jurisdictions, which will be multiple, and which there's not any assumption of state sovereignty.
Okay.
But could be different. So how, you know, think of the border between New York and Connecticut. And it's a border, but it's really a boundary because there are no constraints on passing between New York and Connecticut.
Okay, so let's
except during COVID.
Yeah, and except when Christie closed the Washington Bridge.
The question is whether or not, you know, what we permit. But you know, I live in Toronto, so I pay local taxes and they pick up my garbage. Can somebody from Etobicoke come down and, you know, there are reasons why there are boundaries and you have permissions that are connected.
Okay, so let's use this distinction for a minute, just for purposes of our conversation, at least for the next 10 minutes or whatever. Democratic boundaries, you would be in favor of Joe. You would be in favor of democratic boundaries and no immigration borders, right? Right. And that's the position of the open borders. Now, Paulina, I think you would also favor that? Would that be your position here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So then, Seyla, the question is porousness. Does the porousness allow for the maintenance of immigration restrictions, I think would be the question. Or is the porousness exclusively the dimension of these boundaries in a way?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. I think in the absence of a clearly negotiated agreement concerning labor markets, workers' rights, use of water and air, you know, in the absence of such an agreement, I would say migration would need to be regulated. But hopefully there would be such an agreement which moves one towards a much more federationalist structure. Not federal, but a federationalist structure. And this brings me, I want to make a point about the European Union that Joe made earlier. the European Union is not ideal because what they did is they kept pushing the borders and the boundaries towards the sea and towards the east and the south. Okay, but it is an interesting example for us to think about because it is a federational structure. It's not federal. It's not federal, and there is a big discussion about it. It's like, you know, it's a confederation of sorts, right? And that's what enabled them to eliminate internal borders. But there are still agreements that are being negotiated about economic migration. Okay? I know I'm being too much of a realist in this conversation, but it is
no,
an institutionalist. It's just
no. But I mean, you're raising the issue that Joe raised, which was the framework within which we would be talking about no borders. Which, I mean, Joe, you presented that. I mean, you started off with that in a sense that part of the problem here is that that the notion of no borders is really only going to work well when there are these agreements or when labor is not being exploited in one boundary and not in the other. But so you agree on this, I think, Joe and Seyla, although I hear you as taking different positions ultimately about that, because Joe, I hear you as saying, ideally, we would not have those interjurisdictional differences. It would make for smoother sailing on the open borders, but you're willing to swallow that in a way, or you're willing to say, that's not going to stop the open borders argument, I think, right? Or go ahead.
It's an interesting question. So first of all, I think, again, what I said at the outset, Seyla was operating implicitly within a kind of realist framework. What makes sense in the current context or something like the current context? Perfectly reasonable thing, but then if you juxtapose that with something, what is the ideal? It'll look like there's a disagreement where there isn't really. I mean, there might be some difference about political judgments about what's feasible in the here and now, but it's not a principled disagreement. So part of at the principled level, I suppose the question would be, think about within a nation state like the United States, which has a federal, not a federation, a federal system now, right? Or Canada. So Canada has a national healthcare system, but healthcare is the responsibility of the provinces. Well, what does that mean? Well, the federation sets kind of basic minimum standards, and then the provinces kind of run it and introduce it. So there's some variation. Nobody can stop me from moving from Ontario to even Quebec or British Columbia. There are slight differences in the healthcare system in those two things, so it'll slightly affect, but the federal thing constrains there won't be any fundamental differences. So your basic conditions of life are not going to be fundamental. So that's the idea. Right. In anything we can imagine, there will be jurisdictional boundaries. Okay, they pick up the trash here this way, they deliver that service that way. Right. Where you live is going to affect what you get and how you pay, but within limits. Right. The differences are just not great enough to make a profound difference to most people's lives. That's the idea.
Right. Okay, Paulina, I want to get you in because so I want to hear from you, and then I'm going to come back to this in part. Okay, go ahead, Paulina.
If you want to tease a difference, I think that the place where we disagree is that Seyla said at some point, I think that boundaries have moral value because democracies, I mean, this is the little dirty secret, democracies need boundaries. I learned this from Seyla and I absolutely agree. However, she says, borders have no moral value. Like they're man-made creations, they fall wherever they fall and who cares? I think it's hugely important where they fall. And they're better borders than others. And I think this is where I can embody Harsha Walia, if you will. She thinks borders are very important because they are colonial impositions that not only colonial impositions, they're capitalist impositions, and they come together. The state came in as a colonial imposition and created a political and legal order that established space in a particular way. And that is a terrible injustice that will not go away until we get rid of that order. Mm-hmm. I agree with her to some extent. I think that where borders fall, the fact that the border of Mexico and the United States encompasses text, did I lose you? Did you lose me?
No, we're here.
And that the border of the United States encompasses Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, which were part of Mexico. And the fact that Mexico used to have those territories that were part of the Confederation of the Comanche and the Tohono O'odham. Those are things that matter and have to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about what would a good border be. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and I think that is a big distinction in the way I think about borders and the way we actually, I think Seyla, Joe, and I agree when it comes to open borders.
Yeah, okay, but hold on. So just so that we maintain for a second this distinction between borders and boundaries, you're arguing for place-based boundaries that are jurisdictional for the purposes of the decision-making that takes place in those spaces, right? There's a way in which, I think Seyla, when Seyla says there's a normative dimension to boundaries, then you're in agreement with that, I think, because just to keep separate the boundaries from the border, and we're just using border as the immigration. Now, my sense, although I'm just reading into Harsha Walia's text on page 213, where she writes, a no borders politics is more expansive than an open borders one. It calls on us to transform the underlying social, political, and economic conditions giving rise to what we know as the migration crisis. A meaningful no borders politics requires an end to forced displacement caused by the brutalities of conquest, the voraciousness of capital, and the wreckage of climate change. I think the argument, the underlying argument there is more of a solidaristic, internationalistic, post-capitalistic world that wouldn't have boundaries, wouldn't even have boundaries, because we would be getting beyond capitalism and dealing with climate change and resolving the problems of conquest. So I would think that the argument there would be something more of a, I mean, completely different, obviously, but like a Kantian, world where that is a world without boundaries, I think.
That's not a Kantian world. That's an Edenic world. That's its ideal theory. Kant believed in a Weltrepublik, a world republic that did have the jurisdictional boundaries. So this was his whole point. You can't have a world government without despotism. Forgive me for jumping in, to save Kant here, but.
Okay.
So what I would say, which is a little different from what Seyla just said, is that, so again, let me repeat that I think it is very useful to have arguments made like Harsha Walia is making, because they open doors for people. They enable people to see things that you don't otherwise see. But when I read that kind of passage, I say, what is the picture that you have in your mind of the institutions? What does it mean to say this? Because my whole critique of open borders is that you can't, if you just open borders without changing anything else, that does not create a just world. A just world requires fundamental equality and conditions of life among human beings. That doesn't mean that there should be a world government making every decision about everything. Of course, you're going to have localized boundaries of one kind and another, and then some differences because of those boundaries. So solidaristic, that seems to me, it sounds plausible only if you abstract from the task of thinking through what that would mean concretely. which is what I want to press to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you say abolish capitalism, fine, but what are you putting in its place? How do people decide what investments will be made, what jobs people will get? I'm for economic equality. I want everybody to be paid exactly the same and for collective goods to be provided. But you still have to decide how many nurses you're going to have, how many doctors you're going to have, how many machines you're going to have, who's going to produce them, how they're going to produce them. You can't just assume those problems will solve themselves. So you have to have some story about what the institutions look like, and the same with political decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, to cabin one piece of this conversation, which I think is not necessary to the borders debate, to cabin one piece, which is the larger issue of a more cooperationist society, let's say, and the need for boundaries in order to either achieve that or to not achieve it, or to end boundaries in order to achieve that. I think we can cabin that discussion a little bit, because that's another huge topic, which in part we were dealing with on the, you know, the capital and the property sessions. If we leave it only here to borders, though, I think that I was achieving, I think we were achieving some meeting of minds and disagreements, which I think was productive, which is now, but which raises this question. The difference I'm hearing, I think, between Joe and Seyla, and I will locate you, Paulina, in a second, I think. But the difference I'm hearing still is that, Joe, you both, everyone here is very concerned about internal asymmetries within a boundary. In other words, the European Union may function, or the United States, or Canada, as you were speaking about, Joe. Canada functions well without internal borders, so it's an open borders space in Canada, despite the fact that you're going to Quebec or going to, you know, Ontario or whatever. United States is an open borders country internally. Pretty much you can go, I mean, barring, as you were saying, Seyla, barring the pandemic restrictions, under normal circumstances, barring pandemic restrictions, you can go from New Jersey to New York. You can move, you know, you can move to New Jersey if you want to. You should stay on Broadway, but whatever, you can if you want to. No one's stopping you, right? So there are boundaries, but it functions because there's a certain homogeneity, and the asymmetries aren't that great. Maybe Europe also. Now, and that's important. We have to recognize that. Now, Seyla, you were saying in a way that the reason to maintain migration restrictions is because those haven't been ironed out yet fully. So in other words, that we would need to have union agreements or labor agreements and other kinds of agreements in order to have no borders, maybe between, you know, Europe and Turkey, say, right? Which is not yet part of the European Union. Now, and that the basis for that has to do with these asymmetries, the basis for the restrictions. Joe, I hear you as saying you recognize that problem, but it's not stopping you in a way, which is why you're taking the open borders position. You recognize it, but it's not stopping you. You nevertheless support the open borders. And Paulina, I think, no, yeah, I'm not. Okay, so Joe, I'll let you tell me that I'm wrong. Paulina, I also think that you are recognizing it, but it's not stopping you. if this makes sense. So go ahead, Joe. What's wrong with what am I saying?
Key question is, what are you asking? Are you asking what is our ultimate aim and goal? What is our horizon? Or are you asking what should we do in the here and now? And many layers in between, though it isn't as though there's just two. So I hear Seyla as trying to say, well, here's where we are now, and we have to take account of these constraints in moving forward, not ignore the realities. And that goes to this question of, if you're going to act in politics, you should pay attention to reality. I am in complete agreement with that. It's a mistake to just say, well, open borders is the right thing, so let's just open the borders. The Wall Street Journal wants open borders.
That's right.
I do. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, let's not fall into the trap of supporting the kind of policies that the Wall Street Journal wants. But how can we get there? So sometimes what we can do is, it's desirable to expand immigration. It's let more people in. And there are good reasons why we want to do that. In other contexts, doing it the way some people want to do it would be destructive. So you make a political judgment in a particular context about whether it makes sense, having as a horizon a world, a globe, in which these inequalities no longer function to make it necessary to kind of draw these distinctions. So that, I don't think there's a fundamental distinction between Seyla and me in terms of that kind of ultimate horizon. And then then it becomes a matter of political judgment in a particular context about the desirability of a particular arrangement.
Let me add something to that. I mean, one of the politically most difficult aspects of the present moment and behind the rise of populisms is, in fact, the question of domestic labor versus migration. As long as migrants' rights are not protected, as long as there are no coalitions between domestic labor and migrants, you will have this perpetual, not only conflict, I mean, global capitalism benefits from differential wages. And wage differentials are also very much part of the migration framework, migration reality in Europe as well, by the way. Okay, because countries like the Brexit, for example, were trying to limit too many Hungarian and Ukrainian workers that were coming in and, accepting even lesser work conditions or lesser work privileges than UK workers. So I think the question of economic equality as far as migration is concerned and building coalitions is absolutely crucial, because not all good things go together. There are conflicts of interest in human life. And I just want to say just one more thing to Paulina's position, and then I see it's time to open the question. But Paulina, I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I find this concept of a good border really interesting and very courageous. My only fear about it is that, will it lead to destabilization? In other words, borders are the consequence of history and violence and purchases and negotiations. But the idea of the good border, I think, if it leads to regional jurisdictions, maybe regional coalitional jurisdictions, I think that's the only solution, in my opinion, to the Mexico-US border, is to revitalize that place as a kind of regional landscape for all. But your position is very courageous in that sense, and I hadn't quite reflected on that myself.
Go ahead, Paulina.
Well, actually, I mean, to some degree, I share with Seyla and Joe that, in politics, let sleeping dogs lie is a good way to go in many circumstances. However, we may disagree of, like, when should we wake up the dog? When are times where we should not care about waking up the dog? For example, I think that, okay, so we have internal problems with politics, therefore let's keep those people out while we solve our internal politics. No, or we have economic politics inside. So for example, there's an important argument out there that says, like, migrants destroy the nations, and nations are very good for welfare for keeping the welfare state and having people cooperate. So let's keep people out so that we can keep on having the welfare state, or let's keep people out so that we don't have populism. I'm like, what is the alternative? The alternative is, okay, more people are going to come in and we're going to have to deal with them and with labor problems. What's the alternative? To keep them out? I mean, it's just out of my sight to some degree, because those people are still going to be in bad shape. So I mean, I'm willing to wake up the dog sooner, but in general, I don't want to wake up the dog too much. For example, Seyla, I do want to think about where the borders should go, but I don't want to begin reordering borders tomorrow. So, you know, like the book is divided in three. The first is my critique of the current order. The second part is what the ideal border would be, like the ideal world would look like, following Joe's way of thinking. And the third one is, okay, this is the world we've got. Let's have this orientation, this ideal orientation, and use it to deal with the world we've got. So I guess if you want to tease out our differences, is at what point do we wake up the dog, or what do we consider valuable in the laundry basket? Nobody wants to throw the baby out, but there are some things that we may be willing to throw out, you know, with the dirty water.
My theory is that the dogs are barking anyway.
Okay, let me just clarify or understand something. When we talk about waking up the dogs, is what we're talking about is dealing with whatever is going to happen if we open the border, right? So just to understand, let me just pose a very difficult question, then we're going to open it up to our colleagues, and so please feel free to start turning on your videos, everyone, and please turn on your videos and then start raising your hands. But I'm going to ask a very difficult question. Maybe this is a very difficult question. Again, unfortunately it's my it's the law side of me. Do we open the US-Mexican border right now, Joe?
So one of the examples I often use is Donald Trump said the Democrats are for open borders. Why did he do that? Because he knew that if he could persuade people that the Democrats were for open borders, he would win the election. So do not do something that will get Donald Trump elected.
Okay, yeah, and so that is the political judgment, which to a certain extent, we're not that good at, you were suggesting. We are.
But that much I can say. So I once got asked to testify before a congressional committee because I'd written something about access to citizenship. And I said, well, wait a minute. Are you aware that I've made this argument for open borders? They said, we'll get back to you. Goodbye.
Right. Okay. So your argument for open borders, in a sense, takes into account political judgment. The argument for open borders is more in the ideal theory realm that allows for political judgment today in a particular context, right? Yeah. Okay. And I don't know if I need to pose these questions directly to you, Paulina and Seyla, but what would that's a difficult question, obviously, and it doesn't call for a 1 second answer on in a public seminar, but nevertheless, Paulina, what do you think?
Get rid of ICE.
Yeah. Keep
the border patrol at the border. Mm-hmm. And give visas to people. That's, I mean, immediately, already, then we wouldn't even be talking about the open borders thing, because people would be happily coming and joining their parents and without any drama. So, I mean, nobody would want to cross the desert because they could happily take a plane and arrive in somewhere in the middle of the country and come down the airplane in Kansas and meet their parents. That's how I would like it to be.
Mm-hmm. So basically, ESTA, like Europe, I mean, or like Europe used to be before the pandemic or whatnot, you just get an ESTA visa and bingo, you're there.
We had almost open borders for a while in many respects for products. Many products could come and go. So if products could come and go, why capital could come and go, why can labor come and go?
Okay.
Well regulated.
Okay. Seyla, do you want to give it a shot?
I agree with the last two comments Paulina made. There is the possibility of a visa system under family unification measures for children and relative what, and that is in complete accordance with the Refugee Convention and international law. There is also the possibility of negotiating new migrant worker agreements. I know Braceros has a bad reputation, but something like that is possible. But the third point, amnesty for the undocumented, citizenship, access to citizenship, whatever regulations we put down, access to citizenship of the 11 million so-called undocumented, because the inside is related to the outside. The reason why so many children are coming is because their parents are afraid to leave the country and come and claim them. A lot of them may not be able to do it financially, but there is also the legal fact that they don't want to appear because they're going to be deported. Many of them may have migration delicts on their record. So we have these unaccompanied minors coming, and this is related to the number of undocumented migrants that we already have in this country. So one has to start with that. It's politically extremely difficult, but we have to start addressing all sides at once, I think.
Okay, great. So Arabella, why don't you kick us off? I see your hand up, and then Mayaki, you've got your hand up as well. So go ahead, Arabella.
First of all, thank you so much to everyone. It was so interesting to hear all of you speaking. This question kind of takes this discussion in a different direction, because it seems like everyone is in agreement about, like the US should let in, should let in a lot of immigrants who it's currently keeping out, and same with Europe. But this question was sparked when I was reading Joseph Carens' piece, and there was a line about how there's generally no recognized human right to go where one wants and live where one chooses, and should there be? And kind of framing it in that really general sense made me think about the other side of that, and thinking about, for example, like in Kashmir, when Article 370 was repealed, and that allowed like people from India to suddenly like buy land and to go into Kashmir. I'm also thinking about like there's been recent controversy because there are these like TikTok influencers who are like creating this basically like hippie commune in Guatemala and like taking land there. And a lot of people are getting upset about that as a form of like neocolonialism. And I guess I'm wondering, like, do we want to say that anyone should be able to live anywhere and go anywhere that they want? Because obviously there's certain communities that are being denied that right now. And we're trying to argue that they should be able to do that. But in the other direction, I'm wondering, like, is there any kind of distinction that we can make? Is there a way that we can argue that, like, yes, all of these immigrants who are being held up at the border and not being allowed into these countries, like, should they be allowed in? But at the same time, we want to like push back against these forms of neocolonialism and occupation?
Yeah, great. I like that, Arabella. And let me just, with that, if you'll all notice in the Q&A, there's a question from Marina de la Sierra, which I want to tie that to, and then maybe I'll turn to Joe to start responding to this. But it's a question about gentrification in part, and Marina is asking about restrictions on movement. I think it's coming from another perspective, but it raises a similar question as you were raising, Arabella, about issues of gentrification or technical restrictions, economic forces, as she writes, creating severely restricted areas based on racial and class distinctions, which is a bit of the flip side of what you're arguing, Arabella, I think, but both are connected in a way to this broader question of, what about those restrictions on movements insofar as they may positively benefit communities that are otherwise getting perhaps gentrified or something like that. Yeah, Joe, do you want to try and address some of that, do you think, since it comes out of your text?
So thank you, Arabella. It's helpful because I want to clarify this. I'm not an absolutist about open borders or anything else, almost anything, except being an absolutist. So for example, in the book, I talk about, look, in an ideal world, would there be some communities that would still be able to restrict settlement? So think of indigenous communities, which have powerful attachments to the land. So then their desire to limit who settles in their territory is not a protection of privilege. There's particular identity. So I'm less critical of identity in at least certain forms of identity than Paulina maybe. And at certain forms of identity, it's not. So you have to make a judgment about when these constraints on settlement. And so maybe the Kashmir case, maybe there's a kind of Kashmiri culture and identity. There's kind of a billion some people in India and a much smaller population in Kashmir. If that were just a question of a community there that is being, even if you had an ideal background, so even in an ideal world, there might be some constraints on movement, which I would think were acceptable. Now, if you move to the reality that we're in, you have to make judgments about whether the demand for admission and access is the protection of privilege or the exercise of privilege, or whether it's a challenge to privilege and a desire to overcome it. And so the story you're telling about Guatemala is it's privileged people trying to exercise their privilege. So I wouldn't have any trouble with resisting that. I don't know about the Kashmir case. That was a little ambiguous because it was wealthy people in India. So maybe that's also, but certainly in the indigenous case, restrictions on movement are fine. So, fine, that's too simple, but you have to look at the specifics and the case.
Paulina, do you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I am very critical about identity-based restrictions. Basically the book is written against identity-based groupings and against xenophobia. However, I think that place-specific duties are connected to culture. So, in my view is that everybody come in, but respect the rules of the place to some degree. And these rules might be very tight. So if you come in and do things that you shouldn't do, then there is a limited right that I point out to keep people out when they don't respect place-specific duties. In a country like the United States, place-specific duties are extremely lax, and people are allowed to do most things. And I think that just being here gives you all the rights that everybody else has. But in certain places, you can't just walk and do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And so I call those place-specific duties, and different places have different rules. So you can't just do like the Spaniards colonists did and say, we're not invading you, we're just like doing some commerce here, and suddenly they just took over the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So just like, no, you don't do some commerce here unless the place-specific duties allow you.
Yeah, and in part, that's part of your analysis of the place specificity of locating borders, right? In other words, there's almost there's an inherent tie to cultural norms, probably in your analysis, or some way in which there would be some, I don't know, not homogeneity, but at least understanding within this place specific notion, right?
Let me be quick. I don't want to take all of the space.
No, that's okay.
Think about airport place specific rules. They're very thin. You don't need common plans in life. Everybody knows how to navigate an airport. So the rules in the airport are very thin. Think about place specific rules in a church. Those are very thick. Like not everybody knows how to behave. Mm-hmm. And you need to know a lot in order to step in the right spot. And they vary. That's what I have in mind when I say place specific rules.
Okay, great. Thanks. Seyla, did you want to jump in on this, or?
Well, I mean, the human rights framework can be helpful here. There is a distinction between entry and settlement. And I think that the discussion was eliding that a little bit. We know that now, let's just talk about not asylum seekers, which are a special case, but regular migration and visitation. There are these so-called visa systems, right? Visa systems very often violate human rights requirements because they discriminate. And they discriminate on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity. Let us not kid ourselves. Try to get to the United Kingdom as a Kenyan or as a Gambian. Try to get to France, I don't know, as a Moroccan Algerian. So one way in which you can start dismantling some of this is by looking at the ways in which visa regimes can be absolutely discriminatory, including the visa regime in this country, which has always been a system of discrimination and repression, plus, the lottery and so on. Now, the question of settlement is different. The question of settlement is then bound up with jurisdiction. There are some reasonable conditions that don't violate human rights, and there are some unreasonable conditions which would be a violation of human rights. If country A said that people of origin B, after having fulfilled certain conditions for naturalization, can never be my citizens, okay? This is against human rights. Example, Israel. Palestinians from the territory can never be full Israeli citizens. They are not even permitted to assume citizenship after intermarriage. You see, this is where I think Joe is right. No one has the right to settle anywhere, but there are reasonable and unreasonable conditions. There are conditions that we can defend from a human rights perspective and conditions that we should object to from that same perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Mayaki, go ahead.
Yeah, so to return to the question around what is politically possible or realizable in this moment, and how do we avoid our call for open borders or no borders from leading to certain political responses that could then lead to even more abusive border regimes. I mean, that question in some sense is related to conversations that are also very much relevant to prison and police abolition, which of course have been a very dominant theme over the course of this seminar series as well, where wanting to abolish prisons or police can also very much lead to certain political backlashes. And I think in that context, people have often talked about reformist reforms versus abolitionist reforms, or reforms that take one closer to the sort of ideal end goal versus reforms that actually detract from that, or put you on a sidetrack. And that perhaps is one way to sort of think about what is politically possible without sacrificing sort of our more idealistic or ambitious aspirations. Because in part what I worry about is that in being politically careful or trying to be politically prudent, we may also then entrench those very assumptions that leave borders unquestioned, and that perhaps to try and unsettle those, it's not sufficient to just contest them in an academic sense, but also very much in a political sense, even with the risks that carries. And so, yeah, whether or not there are also actually risks associated with political prudence with respect to migration is perhaps a question that is worth considering.
Yeah, great, Mayaki. And this is somewhat fortuitous, but in a way, I think this ties also to the question, the first question in the Q&A, which has to do with Walia's argument about how borders need to be abolished in part because of their role in reinforcing the carceral sphere within a system of racial capitalism, I think, and that's a larger question than yours, Mayaki, but I think yours is more the temporal question. In other words, in the moment of political judgment, do we worry that not opening the borders will have those effects? And I think the first question was less temporally situated, but is a similar kind of question about the negative effects, the dangers associated with waiting, right? If I understand you correctly, yeah. And maybe I don't know who wants to jump in on that one. Joe, go ahead.
So I think I agree with that entirely, but it just goes to the question of what is a good political judgment. So you're introducing elements which are clearly relevant to a good political judgment. And so you want to think about the long-term consequences of what you're doing, the dangers of asking for too little and settling for less than is possible. Remember the political campaign some years ago, well, many of you won't, for same-sex marriage. So a lot of the people in the gay rights movement wanted to take a very gradual step in the legal agenda. And they were afraid that arguing for same-sex marriage in front of the Supreme Court in 2010 or whenever it was going to have it defeated and set the movement back. But in fact, it won. So in that case, the people who were just more aggressive, there were people who were clearly for gay rights who were arguing for a more cautious approach, and the other people took a radical approach. It succeeded, and it transformed popular opinion, as these kind of legal changes often do. So it's a judgment call. But on the other side, I remember Senator Kennedy, Edward Kennedy. Richard Nixon was president, and he offered to have a guaranteed annual income and a national health care program. He was going to institutionalize it, but at a low level. Kennedy said, no, we're going to do better. Well, 50 years later, you still don't have those. So that was a miscalculation on his part. So there are no guarantees. You can ask for too much, you can ask for too little.
Mm-hmm. Paulina, you've got your hand up. I think it's in response to this question, right? Yeah, so go ahead.
So I think that we all have to take prudential judgment into consideration, but it is important to think of from which perspective. So from the perspective of a person that, sometimes the most prudent thing to do is to grab their baby and cross the desert. That would be absolutely unthinkable for somebody who doesn't have to do that. So what is the most prudent thing to do? For whom? My concern is that we tend to take the perspective of either the state in a 10-year period or an electoral period, or the globe, perhaps, like from a cosmopolitan perspective. And those perspectives are always top down. So my concern is, okay, if we don't open borders in 10 years, well, maybe we won't have populism. But what is going to happen to all those people who have a baby and want to cross? So, is it going to be better or worse? Well, for whom? it's definitely going to be worse for the people who are waiting at the doors. So what is the prudent position? Well, it depends for whom. And I think that we should take the position of those people for whom waiting 10 years is too long to wait.
Right. Okay, great. Seyla, do you want in on this or no? Okay. Kedar, why don't you jump in with your question?
Firstly, thank you everyone for speaking. Professor Benhabib, with your comments on Australia, you got me thinking about in 2004 was the Al-Kateb case, which the High Court of Australia rendered basically a stateless person, mandatory isolation of a stateless person was legal, which is very interesting. And this got me thinking about borders and frontiers. And this connects with an argument that I think Etienne Balibar has been making about how the internal collective personality, or so to speak, the nation form or its existence of, a national entity as such, can kind of adopt, like India with Kashmir, so to speak, the external frontiers and project that as part of its internal collective personality. And this is at the level of ideology, really. But for me, the border, or arguably the border, say in Australia, putting people in mandatory detention legally, perhaps, my point really is how do we get to shift that perception, right? How can borders be shifted through the understanding of an external frontier as part of the internal collective personality of a nation, if that makes sense, following Balibar's kind of reasoning there, if that makes sense at all, guys.
I think that's really a profound observation. And if you don't mind, write in the chat the case that you're talking about. I'd like to see, because I don't know the reference to it. This point that you are making, and just how do we shift the perspective such that external frontiers are also thematized or understood as part of the internal divisions, or if you want, we understand the perspective of the others within us. Who are the others within us? Here, I think the narrative about borders, not just the question of whether borders are good or bad, but also the narrative that surrounds them. The historical constitution of the we. I mean, I don't think that identity questions can be dealt with quite so easily, that there will be problems of belonging and culture, not problems, but cultural identity is going to continue to be significant. Even I'm a cosmopolitan, but I don't believe that a world without culture is either desirable or possible. The question is to understand precisely this interdependence of cultures and to be able to acknowledge, the otherness within us all. I can give you examples from the debate in contemporary Turkey about acknowledging the Armenian Genocide. And that that took place, nearly 100 years, and what that is doing to the internal composition and self-understanding of the nation. Fortunately, it's not yet involved in a border dispute with the Armenian Republic, but it could be. So I like this perspective very much, and I think that the narrativity behind the border is not something that we can easily also dispense with. We have to work with it critically to acknowledge, that there's a phrase of Julie Kristeva that I like very much. It's a psychoanalytically connotated phrase. Nous sommes étrangers à nous-mêmes. We are strangers to ourselves. Decenter the subject a little bit, yeah.
Thank you, Seyla. I have, let's see, Ivan, you had your hand up. Is it still up? Yes. So I've got Ivan and I've got Lias And then I've got a question in the Q&A about climate change, which is important, and we were actually talking about that earlier this week in relation to Seyla's argument. So, Ivan, you go first.
So it's not a fully formed idea yet, but so on the question of open borders, I would like to argue borders as they pertain to the US-Mexico geopolitical border as a synthetic mechanism for controlling labor power within the US. In particular, low-wage industries, as in the case of meat processing and packing plants in Iowa, in Mississippi, where undocumented labor is a way in which wages are synthetically depressed, as was the case with industrial agriculture, as the way it still is, where the Bracero program was very much about that. It was about industrial agricultural leaders wanting to import controlled workers that they could then use to take over the labor power, to dictate the terms of the market. So my question here, can open borders be a way to return labor power back to the low-wage worker or the working class people?
Let's see, who would like to address that? Joe, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So look, I think it comes back to this question about political judgment. So, you know, as I said before, the Wall Street Journal routinely editorializes in favor of open borders. They are not trying to return power to the working class. So you have to make a judgment about what a particular proposal in a particular context is doing. The Bracero program is one thing. So, and then again, this question of political feasibility. One possibility would be say, we're not going to import any farm workers at all. That's just not a possibility. So that has some attractions and virtues, but it also limits, then that means that's a border restriction. So it eliminates a certain kind of exploitations. So there will be judgments. And I think people with the same fundamental value commitments might arrive at different political judgments, coming back to what Mayaki said at the beginning, because of their different assessments about the long-term consequences, where this will lead. If we make this concession, will it legitimate this practice? Or, you know, will it be the opening so that we can have further transformation? Those are not questions that political theorists really are very good at answering, I think. But they are crucial questions in answering the question, what should we do?
Paulina, do you want to jump in on this one? No? Okay. All right, good. Perfect. That was very helpful. The Wall Street Journal is coming back again in here. But I think that is a helpful reminder of some of the ways in which the arguments can be inflected in different directions, right? And that we need to be careful, or at least we need to be sensitive to what might be going on in the argument itself. So right now I've got Lias is next, although Sanya chatted to me, she has a question, and I see Hedwig has a question as well. And we are kind of, and I want to leave some time for each of our guests to wrap things up at the end. So I'm wondering if we are at the point where we should be collecting a few questions maybe, and then allowing our guests to have some final thoughts in relationship to those questions. So why don't we do that? Lias, and then Sanya, and then Hedwig. Okay. Go ahead.
Should I just write down my question?
Then? No. Go ahead and
yeah. So my question will sort of be quick because it's been being dealt with throughout this conversation. But it seems to me that what's come up a lot in this conversation is sort of the gap between factually and descriptively what is and what ought to be, and you know, the concern of how one balances these two concerns. Because, you know, suppose if you allowed the empirical facts to restrict your moral prescriptions, you know, then the worry would be that we'd be satisfied with too little in terms of justice. we'd accept the status quo to a certain extent, even if it were somewhat or even considerably unjust. And so I suppose my question is just to, I realized that Joe was saying that, political theorists are not uniquely placed to give political prudential judgment, but sort of to ask a more practical question with respect to the US-Mexico border. What are the constraining, or what are the most constraining empirical facts, whether it be about the neoliberal sort of capitalist economy or otherwise climate-wise, that constrains your relative theories on how borders should be dealt with, just with respect to that specific context?
Okay, great. Thanks, Liz. Sonia?
Hi, so I'll ask my question really quick too. It has to do with contiguity of borders, where that quality applies. And I understand, and I know that there are many exceptions where it won't apply. For example, maritime boundaries and such. But where it does apply, I'm wondering if that in itself is a property that somehow is different and distinguishable than the question of borders and open borders or no borders. And I ask this because, well, I was pre-med, so I tend to look at borders from a very chemist's point of view, and looking at it from the point of view of membranes and porosity, and how it often is dependent on the chemical nature on both sides. So if we were to look at borders as a function of their contiguity and look at it more as a relational, within a relational context, does that somehow for you give it, I'm curious if that gives it a more realistic dimension. It's easier to build solidaristic notions around that property of contiguity. But I'm thinking, the difference between US-Canada border versus US-Mexico border. So if we were to look at it as a border, as a point of contention, and this notion that points of contentions have potentials, can we look at it as shared space with shared responsibilities, and build from there?
Great, thank you, Sonia. Hedwig?
Yeah, my question concerns something I think we haven't really talked about yet, because we talked about detention, right? But even if people enter the legal immigration processes, in many cases, they're kind of stuck in a often indefinite time limbo. And in Germany, for example, I know that people who seek a legal path to asylum or to immigration are not allowed to work often for a non-determined period of time. And so many of the demands that society, broadly construed, has towards immigrants or asylum seekers are, oh, you need to, integrate yourself, contribute to the common good, and so on and so forth, when any way people could do that is virtually impossible by them being part of the legally required route to immigration. I was wondering whether the speakers have thoughts on how to address this process, and also address the time span, maybe also from a human rights perspective, what can we expect people to endure, and which kind of uncertainty can you impose on people within a legal system if you require them to undergo that process, rather than enter the country legally and never enter into such a process to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Hedwig. And then the only other thing I would add on the table, if you're interested in addressing it, and of course it was, I think, part of Lias's question as well, is the question of global climate change and how that's going to change and affect these questions. And we had an earlier faculty workshop with Seyla's paper, with another paper of Seyla's on Tuesday, where that became a big issue. Michael Gerard raised, of course, the question of how climate change is going to affect all of this, and whether it changes our theoretical position in a way. So feel free to address that as well if you'd like. Now, let's go in reverse order then to close up. And if I recall correctly, so it'll be Joe, Seyla, and then Paulina.
Okay, thanks. So I don't know that I have anything, Leas's question is a good one, but I don't know that I have anything to say specifically about the kind of Mexico and so I'm not going to pretend I do. Sonia, relational. So notice with Sonia's question, it seems to me a perfectly reasonable question. But again, I want to draw attention to the presuppositions of the question. We're basically dealing with the world as it is, and you've got these two countries which are next to each other in different circumstances, and there's certain space, and depending on how you operate, there is space to expand or contract the kind of positive relationships, to pay attention to the relationships and make those. So just in Canada, we've seen that over the years, in the last several years. So Trump comes into power and suddenly he's antagonistic. It's America first. And the Canadians are all saying, well, we used to see, we're friendly neighbors. This is kind of it was real unhappiness with that dynamic. Now, the positive dynamic, as well as the negative dynamic, is constrained. And there are lots of questions about justice, even in terms of the relationships between Canada and the United States, and more broadly, both privileged countries in the rich West, which are not at all on the table in that framework. But within that context, yes, I'm more in favor of a positive relational approach, and that can lead to some good things within a very narrowly defined context, but sometimes that's what's politically feasible in one situation. So it's a good idea, but one should recognize its limits and the presuppositions. Hedwig, the question of the legal restrictions, again, I think, what are you presupposing when you ask that question? What is the kind of background? Are you presupposing something about the legitimacy of the state being able to restrict asylum seekers and they have to prove that they've got a legitimate claim under the Geneva Convention? And what are they obliged to do? So there's a whole set, again, as you clarify the presuppositions within which that question emerges, then you can start to examine whether or not the particular legal constraints that are placed on people are contradictory, whether they meet the standards that you've established. You've got some kinds of standards. I don't think, again, that you can answer that question in the abstract. Notice it abstracts completely from the open borders kind of thing. To ask that kind of question presupposes you're within a framework of the acceptance of state sovereignty and normal state control over borders, but asylum seekers are an exception to which we've signed. There's a whole set of, again, presuppositions that shape the answer to that question. So then you'd have to look at those, and then you could have particular critiques of particular policies, which would be quite powerful and valid in that context. I don't think I have anything to say about climate change, but I did want to say one other thing which illustrates this general approach. Seyla mentioned earlier that part of the reason Brexit happened was because of these workers coming and settling for less in the UK. And what she didn't mention, it's not a critique, it's just when the workers were moving to the UK, mainly from Poland and some of the other Eastern European countries, this was their entry into the EU. There had been the provision that states could say no free movement for 7 years. All of the other states did that except the UK. And if the UK had done that, it might have been that by that time the other economies would have grown, there wouldn't be such movements, the workers wouldn't have settled for less so much, and Brexit may never have happened. So that's an illustration where somebody like me, who's an open borders person and wants free movement, might think that was a mistake. The UK should have instituted that constraint. They could do it, they should have done it. If that would have prevented Brexit, that would have been a better path.
Thank you.
Turn to go.
Yes. And also, let me just quickly say, Eitan, our colleague Eitan Gondugdu is on as well. And if you wanted to turn on your video and say hi, feel free to. Go ahead.
Yeah. There are so many questions I'm trying to gather. I want to begin by saying something to Ivan about the economics of this We have mentioned the Wall Street Journal several times. You know, we know what they mean by a world without borders, but there is something about the question of wage differentials and global justice issues. That is to say, if wage differentials are such that a guest worker in country A within 1 year can make enough wages to support the grandmother at home and 3 dependent children, which is exactly what happens, for example, with domestic workers from Central American countries and so on. What do you say from a global justice perspective? Do you say that that person should not have access to any kind of work or wages? Or do you say, let us see how we can arrange this in such a way that the domestic labor force is not being disadvantaged and exploited? I mean, I think we just have to understand that there are going to be some areas, like picking up strawberries in California, where you may not get any Americans wanting to do that. And you may get a lot of people from Mexico and Guatemala. Maybe this is, shame on me, the John Locke in me, you know, or something like that. You can't ignore these realities. We have to think about them. And there are global justice perspective involved in this, because why are the rights of that Guatemalan worker to a living wage less significant than the rights of a Californian worker to a living wage? No, we have to negotiate and we have to think these questions through. Now, contiguity and maybe an answer to Leah says, no, these are just not answers, but thinking with you, because these are extremely difficult issues. There is a concept that is used in literature and cultural studies that we don't use in the law or political theory, the concept of a borderlands. And I have a feeling that Paulina's framework is about borderlands. Right? I mean, migration regimes are also regimes of livelihood. There are a lot of studies that show how American border patrols and Mexican border patrols cooperate economically in terms of smuggling, the profits that they have. These regimes become like criminal networks, right? So, but maybe if we open the perspective to a borderland that, you know, both sides of the Rio Grande maybe can be joined together in some kind of framework of economic cooperation and coexistence, that would be more fruitful. And that's how I think of contiguity. Contiguity is very complicated, because sometimes what it leads to, it means that the burden of a failed state that is your neighbor falls on you. And so, you know, you end up with all the refugees, which is exactly, you know, what happens with, you know, Lebanon, with Syria and Jordan. Turkey is playing a game, okay? It's also manipulating contiguity for the purposes of the aggrandizement of the regime. But about contiguity, I also want to think through this concept maybe of burden sharing, but also maybe the possibility of creating something new. You talked about the chemistry, right, on both sides of the border. Maybe this is not so different from the concept of a borderland, rather than just, you know, this. And what was the final question? Was the question raised by Hedwig? Oh, I like Joe's answer there. You know, what are the human rights issues involved? Because the undocumented really become the pariahs of our societies, right? They become the untouchables, the unspeakables, and we also have to deconstruct the concept of the undocumented. I mean, sometimes in this country, there is a language, and also in Europe, you're undocumented because you have committed a crime, an original sin. Most people become undocumented because they overstay their papers. They enter as a student, they enter as a family member, and they overstay, they don't know how to negotiate, etc. Europe is a little different in this respect, but part of the tragedy in Europe is that they can't get their act together to do burden sharing. I'm sorry. Shame on the European Union. They have still 50 to 60,000 people on Greek islands, and they have stuck Greece with the mess. These are people from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Iran, from Syria. What is this about? It's partially racism, partially welfare egotism. This is a little different than your question, Hedwig, but there is a total incapacity, even within a federational system, to do burden sharing, right? And that's why if an Afghani person is trying to desperately get out of Greece and ends up coming into Germany and accepts some kind of, illegal employment in the Schwarzmarkt, for me, this is not a human rights violation. Give that person the possibility to regularize, because the original fault, the original burden is yours. You are basically, that is to say, Europe. You're condemning these people, even on your own territory to illegality. What do? The refugees have burned, in one case, their own camp on one of the Greek islands. I mean, human endurance has its limits as well. But if we are not going to go into this kind of perspective, then I'm in agreement with what Joe said. What would be in accordance with a human rights perspective that somehow people could not be regularized on the job market while they're waiting for their asylum status.
Thank you, Seyla. So, Paulina, I think you'll have the last words for us.
Well, there's a lot that I could go on forever, but one of the important things that I think we discovered tonight is that when we say borders, sometimes we think that we have a very clear idea of what we're talking about, but it is very, very soon when one begins to talk about borders that a lot of distinctions come up. So there's the boundaries of democracy, the boundaries of the demos, and then there's the borders of the state. And what does it mean to have a jurisdictional border? There's a geographical border. And then there's the issue when one talks about the border, how do you govern it? So this has to do with what Liaz was saying about the US-Mexico border. So clearly one of the questions is the politics along the border, which has to do with communities and coordination and water management and the geography of cities and economic institutions there in Nogales, in ambos Nogales, and in Tijuana, San Diego, and all of these twin cities that arise. And this is completely different from the priorities of Washington and Mexico City at this moment, right? And so Mexico City and Washington are dealing with energy policy and the TL, like NAFTA redux, and what are we going to do with the new immigration regime, and how we're going to deal with the Central Americans. And so, of course, these are different priorities and different politics and different political theories attached to them. And so this is related to this idea of what we have, and what ought to be, right? My concern here is that we also take for granted that what ought to be is the same thing, that everybody thinks that ought to be is the same, that we all think that we have the same ideal. And I don't think that's the case. This has to do with the way we think about models of what is a state, of what a border has to be. And so this takes me to what Sanya was talking about. When she's thinking about chemistry, I imagine she thinks of the border as a permeable membrane. And so she's thinking about homeostasis, right? I mean, if there's too much salinity on the one side, you're gonna get, like some things crossing one direction and the others. But you get this imagination because you're imagining this permeable membrane when some other people imagine that there's like a line in the sand that needs a wall, and some other people see it completely different. If we think about the actual flows that go through, they're not even like a cell. There's no membrane in many respects, depending on the model we use. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to shift the models we use. I think that in international relations, we have always used this model of a desert island, in which there's a land that is well defined and people like a group of people occupies it and they have a right to it. This is the territorial rights model that started since Victoria and Grotius in the 16th century, 17th century. But we are not committed to this one model. There are other models. And this takes me to the climate at the end. I think that if we have to think about climate change and we cannot avoid it, we have to use different models. And that is what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to suggest that when we think about borders, we can't think of desert islands separated. We have to think about something like watersheds. There are different watersheds, but they are connected and they coexist and they share a lot of things. If we use this different model, the model that I'm calling the watershed model, we could be thinking about a whole range of issues that allow us to think of the what ought to be in a different way than when we think about the what ought to be in terms of open borders of desert islands. And so what I would, we can't keep on talking about this forever because it opens up a whole bunch of different issues, but it does have to do with how we think about border control. Border control is not the same that just having rights of jurisdiction in your territory, and you can claim rights because you have internal legitimacy. Border control has to come from the international system of states, but also from shared concerns that have to do with water and energy transitions and the way those flows affect the continuity of territory. So it's a geographical question. And I'll leave it at that because I could go on forever, but I really appreciated that you at the end asked me the climate change and environment question.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. For me, this has been extraordinarily enlightening, and the distinctions that we've been drawing, I think, at least for me, are going to really help me move forward in this debate, and particularly the distinctions between boundaries and borders, which I think is for me a transformative way to think about these issues. So I want to thank you all for such a splendid and rich and robust conversation, for working out these differences, maintaining the differences, but fully kind of justifying them and helping us see them. Thank you so much, Paulina. Thank you, Seyla. Thank you, Joe, so much for these conversations. It was really fantastic, rich, and really enriching. Thank you, everyone on this evening for your questions and participation. Thank you, Fonda, of course, for making this all possible. We will be meeting for our final session on next Thursday. We got displaced. Well, we had to move this and reschedule this panel, so it's going to be a little back-to-back, but we'll be meeting next Thursday for our final panel, which will be on an abolitionist future. We'll have an amazing contribution by Ian Manuel, who is a poet who spent many years incarcerated in the state of Florida, was incarcerated at the age of 13, spent 20 years in isolation. And we're also going to have a robust critical conversation with Catherine Franke, Derica Purnell, and Gayatri Spivak. So please join us next Thursday, and please join me in thanking our extraordinary guests this evening, Paulina, Seyla, and Joe. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This was fun.